morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you to our discussion today. I'm Angela Stent. I'm the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. And I would like to thank the Polish Embassy very much for organizing what I'm sure will be an extremely interesting and important panel. Of course, as you all know, there was a presidential election in Belarus on August the 9th, one whose results have been disputed, and the feeling is that the results were falsified. There have been protests on an ongoing basis since then, thousands of people taking to the streets in different cities in Belarus, and they have been met with increasing repression. And we saw that again last weekend. The opposition leader, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, is living in Lithuania and is communicating, of course, with the outside world and has her own coordinating committee advising her, one of whose members we will have speaking today. Russia backed, of course, President Lukashenko before and after the elections. The European Union and the United States have imposed sanctions on Belarus, but it is unclear what more they can do in this very difficult and really quite tragic situation. So we are very lucky to have an excellent panel to discuss these issues with us today. And I'm first going to ask the Polish ambassador, Ambassador Piotr Wilczek, to make some opening remarks. He's been in the United States since the end of 2016. And before his diplomatic appointment here in the US, he was a professor at the University of Warsaw and a representative in Poland for the New York-based Kościół Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to educational, cultural, and artistic exchange between the United States and Poland. He is an international scholar. He is very well known for his fierce advocacy of a liberal arts education, which I think we can definitely endorse. This is a very, very important education. And he's taught at a number of universities in the United States. So we are delighted to welcome you again. Thank you, Ambassador Wilczek, and we look forward to your remarks.
Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me now? Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here with you today. As we all know quite well, Belarus has been engulfed in social unrest for many weeks now as a result of its recent presidential elections, which, despite not meeting international standards, declared Alexander Lukashenko the victor. The fallout has included the mass protests and violent state oppression that we are witnessing today. At the moment, the situation in Belarus is highly unpredictable and very dynamic. At this stage, it is difficult to say in which direction this process will ultimately develop and what will serve as the political turning point. What we can say for certain is that Belarus has not witnessed such events in the last 26 years. And Poland, as its neighbor and an active supporter of democratic change, cannot stand idly by and simply watch. Belarus shares with Poland not only a border, but extensive historical and cultural heritage as well. Our countries have a common history, as they were once part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, only to later share the grim experience of domination under Tsarist Russia and soon after that of the Soviet Russia. Our relations have had their ups and downs, yet Poland has played an important role in strengthening the ties between the European Union and Belarus, introducing the Eastern Partnership Program, which aims to strengthen the economic and political links. As Belarus's neighbor, Poland has always been the most active supporter of the country's democratic aspirations. Polish citizens are strongly invested in the fate of their eastern neighbors, evidenced by demonstrations on the street of Polish cities in solidarity with the protesters. In our opinion, this crisis is an internal one. Its solution must be achieved in Belarus itself, and only through honest and constructive dialogue between the Minsk authorities and the protesters. Only in this way, it is possible to achieve the political and social consensus that is indispensable for building a sovereign, democratic, and stable state. That is why we should actively work to facilitate peaceful negotiations between both parties, which ideally should bring about a plan for systemic transition. We consistently call for multilateral diplomatic assistance for Belarus and support initiatives under EU and OSCE leadership. We also support sanctions on those who are involved in political violence against the peaceful protesters. While supporting multilateral action, we should make it clear that the international community will not accept third countries' unilateral attempts to intervene in Belarus's internal affairs. In this context, we should carefully monitor Russian attempts to engage with the situation. We can be sure that Russia is considering various scenarios in Belarus, but can only hope that Moscow joins the international community's efforts to peacefully resolve this crisis. At the same time, while working on the political solution, Poland has offered aid to Belarusian civil society. The Polish government is working hard on the implementation of the so-called Solidarity with Belarus plan, announced on August 14th, worth over $20 million. We are offering help to the victims of state repression and are looking at a long-term investment in the next generations of Belarusians who will be ready to take part in the peaceful transformation of their own country. Most of the funds have already been allocated, which confirms the gravity of the situation. Furthermore, as a matter of urgency, Poland has implemented a visa mechanism to facilitate entry for Belarusian citizens and launched medical and rehabilitation assistance through the Ministry of Health. Nevertheless, Belarusian human rights defenders and Belarusian society expect from us, the democratic West, not only aid, but also diplomatic action to free arrested protesters and political prisoners. Their immediate release would be a desired goodwill gesture on the part of the Belarusian authorities and an important step to enable dialogue. The mass marches that have rolled through Belarus this year demonstrate that the level of mobilization within the protest movement is still high, and that the Minsk government's repeated attempts to intimidate society and discourage the justly angry citizens have been ineffective. The situation is dynamic, and we should be prepared for different scenarios, which is why it is crucial that we remain active and engaged. We cannot abandon the democratic movement in Belarus in its time of need. A democratic and sovereign Belarus is vital to the NATO's eastern flank security, European stability, and thus transatlantic prosperity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wilczek. So our first speaker is Ambassador Pavel Latushka. He's a Belarusian politician and diplomat. He was Minister of Culture of the Republic of Belarus, and he has served as an ambassador in Poland, in France, in Spain, and in Portugal, as well as a permanent representative of the Republic of Belarus to UNESCO. During the 2020 protests, he supported the strike of theater artists, and he was fired from his position on the 17th of August. And Ambassador Latushka is now a member of the Presidium of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's Coordination Council. So welcome, Ambassador Latushka.
Thank you so much for invitation to participate in that very important discussion. You know that Belarus today have a very difficult period in history. It's a dramatic period of our history. I'm maybe sorry for my not good English language, so I will ask to help my assistants, Valentina, to help me to translate. Почему это произошло в Беларуси?
Why did this happen in Belarus?
Первое. Это накопленные проблемы 26 лет правления Лукашенко.
First, these are problems of saved problems that were collected during 26 years.
Второе – это смена поколений.
Second is the changes of generation.
Появились молодые люди, которые не хотят жить в советской системе диктатуры.
Appeared young people who don't want to live in Soviet system of dictature.
Почему произошли события 9 августа?
Why did happen events of the 9th of August?
Первым триггером была просто масштабная фальсификация выборов.
First trigger was mass system of falsification of elections.
Вторым триггером стало безумное насилие 9-11 августа.
Second trigger is unbelievable violence of the 10th, 12th of August.
Это повлекло продолжению и рост протестов.
That put the beginning of and the enlargement of protests.
На улицы начали выходить миллионы белорусов.
Millions of people, of Belarusians, starts to went out on the streets.
Это не только Минск, это все региональные столицы, районные города и даже деревни.
It's not only Minsk, it's regional cities and even villages.
Это стало массовым движением.
It's a mass movement.
Власть вначале испугалась.
Well, power at the beginning got frightened.
Сейчас она прошла этот психологический кризис.
Now it passed through this psychological stop.
И она решила усилить репрессии.
And decided to enforce repressions.
В этот момент не последовало должной реакции как ни со стороны Европейского Союза, так ни со стороны США и других партнеров.
And at this moment there wasn't concrete reactions, nor from the side of the European Union, nor from the side of the USA.
Только несколько из наших соседей заняли четкую позицию.
Only singles from our neighbors took concrete position.
Это Польша, Литва, Латвия.
It's Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia.
Были только декларации.
There were only declarations.
Но никаких шагов реальных по поддержке демократических преобразований.
There were no deeds to support democratic changes.
Конечно, мы отдаем себе полный отчет, что только от белорусов зависят изменения в нашей стране.
Sure, we do understand that all changes depend only on Belarusians.
Но вместе с тем белорусов нет оружия.
But at the same time, Belarusians don't have any instruments and arms.
Манифестанты не проявляют насилия.
Manifestors do not have any tortures, don't do any tortures.
Это уникальный, самый мирный, долгосрочный протест.
This is a unique, peaceful, long-term protest.
Власть, с другой стороны, пошла на убийство.
From the other side, the regime went on murders.
Даже «Голос Москвы» вчера опубликовал статью, признавая, что 10 человек погибло.
Even periodic Voice of Moscow announced yesterday that there were 10 persons killed.
За этот период задержано и арестовано 30 тысяч белорусов.
For this period, there were detained and arrested more than 30,000 people.
В наших тюрьмах начались пытки.
There are tortures in prisons.
Они имели и имеют массовый характер.
They happen and continue being happening in mass examples.
Людей держат по 10-12 часов в отделениях милиции.
People are detained for 10-12 hours in police points.
И
stations.
заставляют стоять, не двигаясь.
And they are made stand, not moving.
Не отпуская в туалет.
Not giving them possibility to go to the toilet.
И они ходят под себя.
Well, and they do this on the place they are standing.
Следующее. В камерах, в которых может находиться только 4-5 человек,
then in cameras where there should be only 4 people,
помещают до 30 человек.
there are more than 30 people in one
Люди
camera.
не могут ни спать,
They can't sleep.
даже стоять сложно, дышать невозможно.
It's even difficult to breathe and stand.
Полиция бросает одну буханку хлеба на 30 человек.
Police throw only bread, one point of bread in this camera
Для 30 человек.
for 30 people.
Если в спортивном зале задерживалось и находилось 100 человек,
If in a sport hall were detained 100 people,
давали одну бутылку воды для всех.
they were given only one bottle of water for all.
И неважно, ковид, другая болезнь.
And it doesn't depend, COVID or another illness.
Хочешь пей, хочешь не пей.
If you want, you drink. If not, not.
Нам известны факты изнасилования даже мужчин, не говоря уже о женщинах.
We do know facts of.
Изнасилование.
I'm sorry.
English word. Sexual.
Of sexual harassment, not only women but men too.
Полиция садилась в машины скорой помощи.
Police were hidden in the cars of emergency help.
И прибывала в места, где находятся демонстранты.
And they came just in the middle of demonstration point.
Открывала двери и начинала задержание.
Opened the doors and started detention.
В машинах скорой помощи.
In cars of emergency help.
Людей просто избивают массово.
People are massively beaten.
Последнее воскресенье.
Last Sunday.
Была разогнана площадь перемен.
There was a meeting in a square of changes.
Люди прятались в подвалах.
People were hidden in low floors of the buildings.
Моя команда держала связь с 43 гражданами Беларуси.
My team held connection with 3 people.
43.
With 43 people downstairs.
Которые спали ночью на бетонном полу.
These 43 people in one room slept on the floor.
Потому что кругом ходила полиция.
Because around there was police were looking for them.
И любой, кто не зарегистрирован в этом районе, задерживался.
And any person who is not registered and not lives in this region, in this house, is detained. District.
То есть фактически мы имеем примеры геноцида.
Factually, we have examples of genocide.
Если ты говоришь на белорусском языке, полиция ставит на тебе красную метку.
If you speak Belarusian language, police put on you red mark.
Это означает, что ты представляешь наибольшую угрозу.
And that means that police thinks that you are more aggressive.
Лукашенко ежедневно нарушает Конституцию.
Every day, Lukashenko betrays Constitution.
Он публично сказал, нужно отрубать руки всем тем, кто дотронется до милиционера.
He publicly told that arms should be cut off for a person who touches army.
Он сказал не брать пленных.
He took not to leave alive anybody, not to take them into prison.
В один день он закрыл право белорусам въезжать в Беларусь.
One day he took the right for Belarusians to come back to Belarus.
Он закрыл право студентам возвращаться в Беларусь.
He took the right of the students to come back to Belarus.
То же самое он сказал медицинским работникам.
The same thing he told to medicians.
То есть он управляет военной диктатурой сегодня.
Well, he uses armed dictator.
Мы имеем правовой дефолт.
We have juridical default.
Право не действует в стране.
Any law doesn't exist in the country.
Адвокаты не могут защищать подзащитных.
Advocates can't protect their clients.
Суды рассматривают дела без адвокатов.
Suits and judges give decisions without advocates.
У нас внешнеполитический дефолт.
we have international default.
Европейский Союз не признал Лукашенко.
European Union didn't admit Lukashenko.
США, Канада, Великобритания не признали Лукашенко.
United States of America, Great Britain, Canada didn't admit Lukashenko too.
Только несколько стран признали его как президента.
Only some countries said that he's a president.
И это Россия, в
This
том
is
числе.
Russia.
И Лукашенко стоит на коленях перед Россией.
And Lukashenko is standing on his knees in front of Russia.
И следующий триггер протестов, который будет иметь место.
And next trigger of protests that will take place.
Третий триггер.
It's the third trigger.
Экономический дефолт.
It's economical default.
И вот эта ситуация в Беларуси сегодня.
Well, here is the situation of Belarus today.
Ну, я еще хочу добавить, что у нас 1000 человек проходит по уголовным делам политического обвинения.
I would like to add that there are also 1000 people who are detained on political views and have criminal prescriptions.
Вот только перед этим зумом
Just in front of this meeting,
позвонил один член Координационного совета,
I received a call from a member of the Coordination Council,
который сегодня подписал обращение белорусских писателей.
who today signed appeal of Belarusian writers.
Он получил информацию, что он должен быть арестован.
He received information that he will have to be detained.
И он просит моей помощи, как ему выехать из Беларуси.
And he asks my help, how can he leave Belarus?
И это происходит ежедневно.
And it happens every day.
У нас появились беженцы.
Well, we have refugees
В Литве, в Латвии, в Польше, в Украине.
in Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and Ukraine,
И, конечно же, в России.
and also in Russia,
Также в Германии.
also in Germany.
То есть это гуманитарная катастрофа.
This is humanitarian catastrophe.
И мы ждем реальных шагов со стороны наших партнеров по поддержке белорусского общества.
And we expect real steps from our friends from European Union
И Америка
and America and Canada
по поддержке белорусского общества.
to support Belarusian society.
О вариантах я готов буду рассказать позже.
I'm ready to talk the possibilities a little bit later.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Latushka. And our next speaker is Marek Menkiszak. He is, since 2006, the head of the Russia department at the Center for Eastern Studies, which is a state-backed think tank based in Warsaw. And he used to be a faculty member at the Institute of International Relations at the University of Warsaw. He is one of Poland's leading experts on Russian-European relations, on Russia, and security in the post-Soviet space. He has had a number of positions in a number of different think tanks. And the one that I remember most fondly is when we were both fellows at the Transatlantic Academy of the German Marshall Fund of the United States from 2015 to 2016, when we were all working, a group of us, on a project on Russia and the West. So we look forward to hearing his remarks on Russia's role in this crisis.
Thank you very much, Angela, for a wonderful introduction. I'm very privileged to be here and speak with such a great panel. I indeed would like to focus my initial intervention on the quite important subject of the Russia's approach to Belarus crisis, to develop dramatic developments in Belarus. I think it's beyond any doubt that Belarus is a special place for Russia from the perspective of the Kremlin. Even among the post-Soviet countries, it's the second most important after Ukraine country. It's unlike Kyrgyzstan, it's unlike Armenia. Therefore, the stakes are high for Moscow. And that's why Moscow behaves in such a way towards Belarus. We have to remind ourselves that the Moscow policies, Moscow tactics towards Belarus has evolved over the couple of years, several years. So clearly, since mid-2018, the Kremlin came to a conclusion that the current model of relations between Russia and Belarus, based on basically to a large extent subsidizing the Belarus economy, but with having inadequate, from the Russian point of view, level of political integration with Belarus through the Union state is no longer acceptable. Therefore, there has been increased coercion, political and economic coercion towards Lukashenko regime from Moscow to get into more the further integration process within the Union state. However, it was interesting to see, to observe that since more or less the beginning and the spring, especially of 2020, this kind of Russian pressure somehow been relaxed. It was visible that the Kremlin gave a pause to Lukashenko in order to for him to be elected president. So there were certain trade-offs, there were certain interim agreements on oil and gas deliveries for Belarus from Russia. So there was a kind of a pause. At the same time, Moscow pursued a policy of kind of intentional ambiguity concerning Belarus elections. And on one hand, it was kind of political support, very kind of rhetorical support for Belarus and the authorities of Belarus. On the other hand, there were certain hints or certain kind of soft trolling of Lukashenko by the Russian media, and kind of doubts arised from some people that even Moscow may be willing to unofficially support certain opposition candidates in those elections. However, Moscow officially has not been vocal on that matter. It was rather clear that Moscow counted on a scenario in which elections will be falsified. Lukashenko will crush the protests after the elections, and it will sever the relations between Belarus and the West, and actually will make Lukashenko totally dependent on the Russian support, and it will force him to get along with the Russian pressure over further integration with Russia. So basically a kind of a repetition of the December 2010 scenario in Belarus. However, Moscow has been very much surprised, as most of us were, about the scope, the mass character, and the persistent character of the protests in the wake of presidential elections. That was a real surprise for Moscow. And in the beginning, in the initial days and weeks, Moscow took certain wait and see approach towards developments in Belarus, assessing this situation and focusing first of all of checking what will be the outcome of the protest movement, and not trying to be too much vocal about its direct involvement in Belarus. However, since around late August, Moscow has sent a clear signal of support for Lukashenko. So the Putin offered a partial security service support in case of further radicalization of the protests, and also offered very limited economic financial support for Lukashenko regime. That was, in my assessment, a signal both for the protesters and also for the broader elite in Belarus, as well as for the West, to kind of creating a red line that Moscow feared that there will be a radicalization of the protest, which may change the dynamic of the situation, which may cause some cracks within the regime. So that was a signal that you can't count on our neutrality in that matter. So we will give Lukashenko, if he will need that really, our full full support. Basically to deter both the protest and the West from escalation scenario in Belarus. And when this kind of immediate danger somehow subside, there was also a kind of a pressure, increasing pressure on Lukashenko to deliver on so-called constitutional reform. The Russians constantly using the rhetoric of constitutional reform, which Lukashenko himself has promised initially, but it seems that, at least at this point, Russia is not prepared to blackmail anyway, politically or in economic sphere, Lukashenko really to deliver on the matter of so-called constitutional reform. And that actually leads to a kind of basic question what Russia wants in the current situation. And I think there are a few points to make. One, first of all, Russia does not want to allow the protest movement to succeed and to enforce a regime change, which Russia can't control. That is a kind of a nightmare scenario Russians would like to avoid. On the other hand, Russians are worried about the possible rise of anti-Russian sentiments in Belarus. So kind of repetition, of course, very differently, a kind of Ukrainian scenario. So they try to measure their direct involvement, however, clearly not wanting the protest movement, the democratic movement to succeed. Because there's a kind of color revolution scenario, which is Kremlin is obsessed with in negative sense. The second point is that Russians would like to send a signal to the West that the Russia's sphere of influence in Belarus can't be disputed, and that no Western engagement in Belarus could be accepted by Russia. And of course, there are some elements of political paranoia which do exist in Russia. So kind of belief, not only propaganda, but real belief that there are some hidden forces behind the protest movement, that there are some ongoing special operation orchestrated by the West and so forth. On the third point is the Russians would like to encourage Lukashenko to deliver so-called constitutional reform, but I think they accept the reality that Lukashenko would like to fake this. The Russians would simply want to move the political protest out of the streets in Belarus. Of course, they would like to see Lukashenko weakened, and they would like to see, for example, partial reform executed, especially increase of the role of political parties and the role of parliament, when the Russian forces could play more actively in Belarus and internal scene through the new political parties probably to be established in such case. But again, I believe it's not a kind of ultimate blackmail that they are providing Lukashenko with. And finally, the Russians would like to push Lukashenko into gradual enhancement of integration with Russia, whether through the salami tactics, so gradual process, or through sort of a grand bargain. And of course, this grand bargain, which is supposed to be proposed by Moscow, especially in mid-September this year, that is a offer of big financial economic support and improvement in terms of energy relationship with Belarus in exchange for acceptance by Lukashenko of the Russian model of integration, namely to accept the 31 roadmaps, so-called roadmaps for enhancement of integration, which has been initially agreed before. Concluding my remarks, I believe that despite existing negative feelings about Lukashenko and the Kremlin, and it's not a secret that there is no trust in Moscow towards Lukashenko, and there is a great deal of annoyance in Moscow towards Lukashenko. But I do believe that the Russians are not wishing to get rid of Lukashenko, at least not yet. And they are not ready to enforce the political transition in Belarus, fearing possible risks involved in that process. So they will continue to tolerate and support Lukashenko, trying to maximize potential political benefits, and believing that Lukashenko simply cannot escape, that he has no other way than to eventually succumb to Moscow's demands on further integration. And that leads to the final point, which is that Russia cannot be a real partner in any sense of the West in attempts to sort the Belarus crisis and to be somehow instrumental into the process of democratic transition. We should not be naive, we should not count that Russia can be a positive actor in that process. So Russia is a part of the problem. Russia is not a part of a solution.
Thank you very much. That was a very clear statement. And our final speaker is Ambassador Kenneth Yalowitz. He was a US Foreign Service officer for 36 years. He was ambassador to Belarus from 1994 to 1997, also ambassador to Georgia from 1998 to 2001, and he served 2 terms also in Moscow. And he was chosen for the Ambassador Robert Fraser Award for Peacemaking and Conflict Prevention in 2000 for his work in preventing the spillover of the Chechen War into Georgia. When he left the Foreign Service, he became director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College, and he has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University for many years, also some other universities. He teaches a very popular and highly regarded course on conflict resolution here at Georgetown. So we welcome your remarks, Ken.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Stent. Let me just begin by really sincerely complimenting the first 2 panelists and Ambassador Wilczek. Both of you spoke beautifully and very incisively, and it doesn't leave me a heck of a lot to say, because I agree with so much of what you have to say. What I wanted to do, though, is to provide a little bit of context here. I was in Belarus as the US ambassador from 1994 to 97. And saw the process in which Mr. Lukashenko, who was popularly elected, this is something we tend to forget, mainly on an anti-corruption campaign, basically used the KGB handbook for how to take over a fledgling democratic state, although that would be very charitable where Belarus was at that point. and turn it into what I used to call a living model of the Soviet Union. And it's worth remembering the steps that he took, because it helps explain, I think, today, why this system, has survived, now for 26 years, and why it is so difficult, to uproot it. Belarusian society at that point was far different. It has changed dramatically, as Ambassador Latushka says. A new generation of young people, better educated, very computer savvy, knows how to organize using the social media. All of these things, have helped very, very much in organizing the demonstrations. But what I saw Lukashenko do over the course of the 3 years there, and I sometimes joke about the fact that I still have scars on my back from the number of times that I directly confronted him on a number of these steps. But they included dissolving the then popularly elected parliament and installing his own totally subservient parliament, complete control of the judicial system, as Ambassador Latushka has mentioned, created a parallel structure, the vertical, from the local level to the very top, of loyalists to him. It was almost like the Communist Party structure paralleling the government structure in the Soviet Union. The press was virtually totally taken over. The opposition was vilified. Usually, and Ambassador Latushka mentioned how the police go after people speaking Belarusian. He degraded the Belarusian language, accused people who were Belarusian nationalists of basically being Nazi supporters, hearkening back to World War II, again, somewhat like what was happening in Ukraine. And basically, I also saw how demonstrations were brutally dealt with. There were also the beginnings of we've seen now of actual people being killed, and we saw some of that as well. I've never forgotten going to visit the then Interior Minister, Mr. Zakharenko, who, believe it or not, was considered one of the more open-minded individuals in the Lukashenko regime. And I saw him at noon, and at 2 o'clock that afternoon, he was gone. His office was, sealed, and he later physically disappeared. But perhaps most importantly, I watched the process of how he totally took control of the military, the security apparatus, and the intelligence agencies. And this, to me, remains crucial for today because, and that's one of the questions I would like to ask Ambassador Latushka. One of the things that I've been saying consistently is that as long as these forces remain loyal to him and are willing to commit the atrocities that they are doing, it's going to be very, very difficult to dislodge him. And I think we also have to face the possibility that if Lukashenko is removed, that his successor may not be, from the democratic opposition, but maybe one of these Siloviki, who now surround him. And I mentioned the example of Egypt, where the Arab Spring turned into the dictatorship of the president, a military figure in Egypt. But I think looking at both Iran and Venezuela, you can see how difficult it is, despite massive protests and great opposition to the regime, for these opposition movements to be successful. And God knows I fully support what the opposition is doing in Belarus. When I was there, I never would have imagined that this type of grassroots kind of development would take place. And I really pay great homage to all those in Belarus who are risking their lives and their well-being, physical, to join this. I now want to turn to, what Professor Stent asked me to discuss, and that is, Western responses. Ambassador Latushka was critical, and I believe correctly so, in analyzing the fact that Western responses so far have mostly been in the area of declarations, diplomatic protests, sanctions. All of these things are very, very important and very useful. Unfortunately, looking at the situation realistically, and this is where it gets painful to deliver this message, I think the problem is that no one in the West right now wants a conflict with Russia. The relationships with Russia are so bad between the United States and Russia already, and obviously there are difficulties, with Europe as well. Ukraine remains a running sore. We've just now seen what's happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, where Russia has initially been very cautious in what it was doing, not wanting to take sides, but now has emerged with seemingly a diplomatic victory, in causing this ceasefire to be enacted between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So the Russians are demonstrating, in many ways, as what Mr. Menkiszak said, that this is their backyard, and they are trying to demonstrate again and again and again that this is their sphere of influence, and the West has no role in it. I do think that the sanctions, the diplomatic support are very important. They may not be determinative, but I think they keep alive a spirit in Belarus, the fact that, that you are not forgotten. And I think there is a ray of hope, with regard to the United States. We've just had our election, a very messy business, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. But we do have a president-elect, and he has already spoken out about Belarus, very strong statements in favor of the demonstrations, the fact that Lukashenko is an illegitimate president. And I would not be surprised, whatsoever, when Mr. Biden becomes President Biden, to see new sanctions, particularly on those, surrounding Lukashenko and who are enabling him, and also, more steps that will be taken in conjunction with the European Union. Biden is much more inclined to deal with allies than the present administration. I think you're going to see a lot more joint action between the United States and the European Union in support of what is going on in Belarus. My sense of the Russians and Lukashenko right now is this is what I would call a game of chicken. Who is going to blink first? And as long as the security forces stay loyal to Lukashenko, and they now have every incentive to do so, because they know if the opposition comes to power that these guys are going to go to jail and suffer some very, very bad consequences. So as we've seen in other dictatorships like this, the security forces, as long as they are well paid and taken care of, tend to remain loyal, to the regime. And that is unfortunately, a fact of life. But I think, again, on the Russian side, I think that they are also looking, there were hints of it, as Marek mentioned, looking to a possible successor to Lukashenko. Whether they've identified anybody and whether they will do something like that, I don't know. The last thing I think that the Russians want to do is to intervene militarily in Belarus. That would create a situation in which a population right now is not demonstrating to join NATO or the EU, but basically is demonstrating for democracy, for human rights, and for an end to this illegal presidency. They don't want to see that turn into another Ukraine. I think they've learned that lesson. So I think they are going to stay with Lukashenko to see if he can deal with this. And I say that's where the game of chicken, comes in. I hope and pray that, that these demonstrations continue peacefully. I noticed that, that the intensity increased again after the death of Mr. Bondarenko. And I think what Lukashenko is counting on is with the winter and all of these arrests, that the opposition will begin to dissipate and that he will be able to hang on. Unfortunately, I think that is, probably the scenario that may come about for the next year or so. But while I was in Belarus, many years ago, I always felt that Lukashenko's, time was limited and that the Russian support for him was going to be crucial. And I do think that, the Russians, recognize, that he is a running sore in a place that is very vital to them. They will support him initially, but I am not surprised whatsoever if they are going to be looking for alternatives. And I think that's where the US and the European Union, if the pressure is kept up, if the popular pressure, stays, Russia, I think, has learned from many actions that have been grievous in the West, that you just hold out and eventually the Western opposition, may dissipate. I'm not sure that's going to be the case with the United States and President-elect Biden. Our Congress is very strong on Russia right now. The interventions in our elections, Ukraine, for a whole variety of reasons, that's not going to change. So I think the opposition, in Belarus today can count on, continuing strong United States and European support. Perhaps not as strong as Ambassador Latushka would like, and I understand that, but it is going to remain strong, and Belarus is not going to be forgotten.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Yalowitz. So I encourage people to use the Q&A function to type your questions, and I will get to that in a minute. But I do want to go back to Ambassador Latushka and wonder if you could answer the question that Ken Yalowitz posed, and I think people are very interested in the relationship of the security forces to President Lukashenko, if you foresee any circumstances where their support for him could change, because obviously that would be crucial going forward to see how long he stays in power.
Я бы хотел, ответив на этот вопрос, также затронуть тему России.
While answering this question, I would like to touch the topic of Russia.
Я являюсь членом Президиума Координационного совета.
I'm a member of Presidium of Coordination Council.
Также мы создали бывшие чиновники.
So, ex-diplomats, ex-governors and diplomats, we created
Народное антикризисное управление.
National Anti-Crisis Management.
Для помощи Светлане Тихановской.
To help Svetlana Tikhanovskaya
И Координационному совету.
and Coordination Council.
В наше управление входят также члены Координационного совета.
This management includes also members of Coordination Council.
Сегодня мы опубликовали двушаговую стратегию.
Today, we published two-step strategy.
Вы можете найти на нашем сайте NowBuy.
You can see it on our website NowBuy.
Она заключается в следующем.
This system is about.
Первое.
First,
Европарламент и Еврокомиссия
Europarlament and Eurocommission
должны выполнить резолюцию Европарламента от 28 октября этого года.
Must enlarge the position of Europarlament and the resolution of Europarlament of 28th of October 2020.
И создать миссию высокого уровня.
And create mission of high level
для разрешения кризисов как внутри Беларуси, так и вокруг Беларуси.
To resolve crisis as inside and outside the Belarus.
Эта миссия не будет эффективной.
this mission won't be effective
потому что Лукашенко не захочет с ней говорить.
because Lukashenko won't talk to them.
Поэтому
want to talk.
необходимо установить четкий контакт с Россией
So there must be made concrete contact with Russia.
и включить в эту миссию высокого представителя России.
And a high representative of Russia should be included in this mission.
Повестка дня этой миссии
The agenda of this mission
привести к реальному результату в следующих трех моментах.
is to lead to real result in third next moment.
Первое –
First.
это освободить всех политических заключенных.
Release all political detained.
Второе – это прекратить, наказать виновных в преступлениях.
Second, punish guilties in these crimes.
И третье – это провести новые выборы.
And third, to have new democratic elections.
Новые демократические выборы с точки зрения России могут иметь только конституционный характер.
From the point of view of Russia, new democratic elections can be held only from the constitutional point of view.
Пример Украины.
As an example, Ukraine.
Изменение президента они назвали государственным переворотом.
Well, changement of the president they called governmental turnaround.
Поэтому мы предлагаем конституционный способ.
So we offer constitutional way.
Сейчас мы должны говорить о принуждении к диалогу.
Now we're talking about enforcement for dialogue.
Потому что Лукашенко не хочет говорить ни со своим обществом, ни с международным сообществом.
Because Lukashenko don't want to speak nor to his society, nor to an international people.
Как принудить Лукашенко к диалогу?
How to enforce Lukashenko to dialogue?
Это максимально широкие санкции.
It's maximum wide sanctions.
Сегодня ночью по белорусскому времени мы ждем решения Палаты представителей США.
Today at night, we are waiting the decision of Palace of Parliament of the USA.
Планируется принять акт о демократии.
It is planned to accept Act of Democracy,
Democracy in Belarus.
of democracy.
В этом акте предусматриваются четкие санкции
This act is preserved concrete sanctions
в отношении сотрудников КГБ,
against KGB workers,
МВД
Minister of Internal Affairs,
и других специальных служб.
and other special services.
Предлагается включить финансовые ограничения по кредитам для режима.
It is also offered to include financial restrictions on credits, etc.
Планируется ввести санкции в отношении не только семьи Лукашенко,
To impose sanctions not only for the family of Lukashenko,
но также правительственных чиновников высокого уровня и их семей.
but also governmental workers and their families.
Следующее – это санкции в отношении России.
Next, there will be sanctions against Russia.
In this draft of act, it's also included. Санкции в отношении тех компаний, которые помогают режиму Лукашенко.
Sanctions against companies who helps the regime of Lukashenko.
Санкции всем тем, кто помогает так называемому союзному государству Беларуси и России.
Sanctions against those who helps so-called Union
Union of Russia and Belarus.
Union of Russia and Belarus.
Это давление на Россию.
This is pressure on Russia.
Сейчас санкции Европейский Союз планирует принять решение, третий список, в четверг.
The third list of sanctions it is planned to accept by European Union on Thursday.
Я написал письмо главе Европарламента и руководителю внешней службы ЕС Боррелли.
I wrote a letter to the head of Europarlament and head of
High Representative of the Foreign Policy and Security of the European Commission, Mr. Borrelli. And in this, my letters, I proposed, first of all, to create this high-level mission, and secondly, to improve maximum possible sanctions against the regime, list of the persons who will be not welcome more in the territory of Belarus, not only the political leaders, but also the prosecutors, the investigators, judges, which are participate, all the members of the civil state, civil services, which are participating in falsification and which are now in the torturing of Belarusian people. We are waiting for the wider, maximum possible list of such persons. Now in this list only 50 persons. In 2011, when it was after the elections, so last elections, president, not last, but 2011 elections, on the list were 170 persons. Now we have 30,000 people arrested. Now we have people which were killed by police. Now we have tortures, and the European Union have on the list only 50 persons. It's difficult to explain for the Belarusian society. And of course, point economic sanctions plan European Union to proclaim in this Thursday. So now we will receive the situation of the window of the possibilities. We understand that these sanctions can be in power in United States only in the January, because when Biden became a new president legally, and it will be new president administration, and then they can push the
Button.
Push the button. It's very important to understand. Secondly, European Union sanction is not on the maximum level, but it will be the set step of the European Union. So for Russians, it's a window of possibilities. And we want to explain for the Russian governmental authorities, we are on the contact with some of them, that it is a chance for the Russian to be a real participator of the solution of the Belarusian situation. Because our idea now is a position, first of all, to change on the post of the President Lukashenko. No more Lukashenko in Belarus. And secondly, of course, is the process of the democracy development of Belarus. But we have a great, very difficult partner, Russian Federation. So what we can propose for the Russians? First of all, we can say that, okay, we're ready to have a close relation with Russia, because now in the Belarusian society is not anti-Russian atmosphere. It's not anti-European atmosphere. It is pro-Belarusian atmosphere. People struggling for its own rights in the territory of Belarus. But you should to know that at the beginning of this year, in the January, 60% of the Belarusian people were for the closer relation with Russia. Now, sociologists telling us that it's only 30%. So it's twice back, twice down. And European Union for Belarusian people, Belarusian people are for the better relations with the European Union is 30%. So it is now in this cross. So for Russians, it's a risk. If they will continue this policy, if they will continue to have a dialogue with illegal Lukashenko, never will tell that it's crimes on the territory of Belarus, the tortures in the territory of Belarus, they will lose their own image in the Belarusian society. And in the perspective of the 3-5 years, it will be anti-Russian platform, very active in Belarus. And it's a risk of the Kremlin now. And what we understand, they understand this. So they want to change Lukashenko. But for them, it's the main point, who will be the next president? And we try to explain to them, it doesn't matter who will be, because today it will be not against Russia president. It's not atmosphere. But if they will wait for several years, it will be anti-Russian president. So it's our arguments. You can read in our internet page all this line. So now our position, enforcement for dialogue with Lukashenko, mechanism international high-level mission with participation with Russian. Secondly, to enforce the sanctions. And if it will be everything together, it can be the result. Because if not, it will be years of very difficult, dark, black period of the history of Belarus.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to go to some of your questions, and I'm going to start out here with a question from Marek. You mentioned this, but could you give more details? Is Russia using information warfare in Belarus in order to repress, smother the messages of the protesters without having to send Russian military or police to...
That Moscow has been ambiguous somehow, especially before the elections. And you could see, for example, that the Russian propaganda main TV channels, state-controlled channels, somehow paid attention and covered the rallies of opposition candidates. There has been certain trolling of Lukashenko, and even during the dramatic events, the Russian TV stations showed brutality, including the police brutality in Belarus. But also we may add that the Russians very openly pressured Lukashenko over the constitutional reform, the need for dialogue. They said that, for example, that there are some genuine voice of the people who should be heard by the Belarus authorities. And also, for example, very recently, there has been a kind of a partial condemnation of the police brutality by the spokesman of the President Putin, Mr. Peskov. However, quoting Lukashenko himself, so that was very half-hearted condemnation. But on the other hand, there were these clear signals, the several visits of high-ranking FSB officers from Russia, sending support for journalists, state TV-controlled journalists to support propaganda for Lukashenko and state Belarus TV programs. Probably also IT technicians and technical specialists sent from Russia to Belarus. And of course, the famous offer by Putin to send in National Guard, guardsmen and OMON police forces from Russia to Belarus if there is a case of a need to use it. So that was kind of balancing act by Russia, but it was very asymmetric, and it still is. And my second point, I would like to comment. I really would like to believe that the Russians would be ready to accept a kind of personal transition in Belarus. I do agree that the Russians are very angry on Lukashenko, that they do not trust Lukashenko. They believe that Lukashenko has cheated on them many times. And of course, in kind of perfect scenario, Russians would like to have this kind of more or less democratic process in which not anti-Russian candidate, obviously, because no candidate which is openly anti-Russian could win in Belarus, would be accepted as a new leader. The problem is, however, that the Kremlin's perception is very much dominated by this paranoia that any democratic process which will be allowed, which eventually bring Belarus closer to the West, not closer to Russia, that the democracy, the freedom of choice is a threat for the Kremlin. It's not necessarily openly critical or openly anti-Russian attitudes. It's simply the lack of the brutal political control, which allows to really people to be free to choose, is considered a threat in Moscow. That is unfortunately, I think, the reality which really hampers any kind of pragmatic approach from the point of view of Moscow towards the recent the development in Belarus. So, but I do believe that it was very rightly pointed out by Ambassador Latushka that there should be also pressure on Moscow on that matter, that also Moscow should feel that there are costs involved of the policy of support for Lukashenko. So they have to somehow weight the pros and cons and weight also the costs of the policies if they really would like to have a normalization of relations with the West.
Thank you. Here's a question, I guess, for Ambassador Latushka and anyone else who would like to answer it. How has the massive participation of women in the protests in Belarus influenced the trajectory of the movement? Has there been a change in attitude of security officers of using violence against women as the protests continue?
Спасибо. Thank you so much for this question. It's very important. Прежде всего, сам процесс выборов.
First of all, the process of election itself.
Когда Лукашенко посадил всех кандидатов в тюрьму,
When Lukashenko imprisoned all the candidates to
выслал их за границу,
send them abroad,
у нас появилось 3 прекрасных женщины.
we received 3 wonderful women.
И Лукашенко был уверен, что он без проблем выиграет у женщин, которые никогда не были в политике.
And Lukashenko was sure that without any problems he will win elections and leave these 3 women behind.
А белорусы показали свое реальное отношение к женщинам.
But Belarusians showed their truly vision of women.
И тогда вот действительно этот героический поступок женщин, которые стали в защиту своих мужей,
And this heroic, act of women who stand defending their husbands
стал одной из главных причин, почему Тихановская победила.
was one of the reasons why Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has won.
И, конечно, главной причиной было протестное голосование.
And of course, the important reason was protesting voting.
Когда я шел голосовать,
When I was going to vote,
мне нравилась идея 3 женщин,
I liked the idea of 3 women,
но я все-таки голосовал протестно.
but I voted in protest.
Сейчас я узнал Светлану лично.
Now I know Svetlana personally.
И я вижу, что она уникальный человек.
I see she's a unique person.
Так же, как уникальные женщины, которые в первые дни после террора или после пыток в тюрьмах
And also unique women who first days from tortures in prison
вышли на улицы Минска и других городов Беларуси.
went out on the street of Minsk and other cities of Belarus.
Просто в белых платьях с цветами.
Just wearing white dresses and having flowers in their hands.
И Лукашенко испугался женщин.
And Lukashenko was afraid of women.
Мы получили справку МВД,
We received information from Ministry of Internal Affairs.
official document, где было написано, что в период с 9 августа по 3 ноября
And there it was written that during the period from 9th of August till
3 ноября
3rd of November,
было задержано 25 800 граждан.
there were detained 25,800 people.
Сейчас это уже 30 тысяч.
Today it's already 30,000.
И процентов женщин среди задержанных это около 20.
And percent of detained women, it's about 20%.
Почему?
Why?
Женщин практически половина на митингах.
There are, you can observe on the meetings, there are almost 50 manifestations, there are 50% of women.
Но задерживают их меньше.
But they are detained less.
Полиция боится воевать с женщинами.
Police are afraid to detain women.
Но это было.
But it was.
Сегодня уже нет.
Today, no.
Сегодня в Минске задерживают женщину, которая идет просто с цветами.
Today, a woman who is walking alone with flowers is detained.
Потому что в этот момент рядом проходит акция.
Because this moment, somewhere nearby, there is a manifestation.
И женщина идет сидеть в тюрьму на 15 суток.
And woman is going to be imprisoned for 15 days.
Сегодня вышел из тюрьмы сын моего родного брата.
Today, went out of the prison my nephew.
Но сегодня он был задержан в тот день,
He was detained the day
когда была задержана мисс Беларуси,
when there was detained also Miss Belarus.
которую я знаю лично.
I know her personally.
И это потрясающая женщина.
She is a wonderful woman.
И Лукашенко знал ее лично.
Lukashenko knew her personally.
И поэтому он сказал, что она будет сидеть не 15 суток, а 29.
So that's he who told she will be in prison not for 15 days, but for 30 days.
Вы должны понять, что для Лукашенко уже не имеет значения категория, сфера.
You should understand that for Lukashenko there is no any difference between personality or category or.
Он сажает молодежь,
He imprisons young people,
пенсионеров,
pensioners,
медиков,
magicians,
деятелей культуры,
cultural elite,
науки,
signs.
Рабочих,
Workers,
бывших
factories,
полицейских мучают, особенно в тюрьмах.
ex-policemen are tortured, especially.
То есть неважно категория.
There is no depends of professional
Но
category.
роль женщины в этом процессе, конечно, была и есть ключевой.
But the role of women in this process in general is key role.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions here for Ambassador Yalowitz. The first one is, what is the best way for ordinary American citizens to help? How do we send support to Belarusians, and what kind of support is necessary? And a similar question, it was said at the beginning that the sanctions by the EU and the US were the only thing that these parts of the world could do to hold the Belarus government accountable. Is there anything else any of the panelists see as another step they could take that could make an impact?
Well, the U.S. sanctions and the European sanctions, unfortunately, in a situation like this, its sanctions are the sort of the first remedy. I do believe, I agree with Ambassador Latushka that that Russia needs to feel more of the pain as well. The sanctions that were imposed on Russia after the Ukraine violence and invasion, I do believe have hurt. They've not changed Russian policy, but it has clearly caused them a good deal of economic pain. And Ambassador Latushka mentioned briefly the Belarusian economy, and we probably should have spent a little bit more time on that because it really is in free fall. And if there is a real weak spot, it is probably the Belarusian economy. The Russians may step in and help, but that's not going to be a long-term possibility, I think, for them. So I do support what Ambassador Latushka laid out in terms of getting Russia involved in this with sanctions and also a great deal more Western pressure combined is a very good thing to do. The only problem, again, looking at this realistically, is sanctions. Other than the case of South Africa, I think it's kind of hard to demonstrate that sanctions alone bring what you want. What we've done with Iran is a classic example of, just the screws are constantly being tightened, but it has not produced the result that we want. So what I think the average American can do is to certainly write to members of Congress, senators, to support the legislation that Ambassador Latushka mentioned. They should write in support of assistance, humanitarian assistance to those who are suffering, and to do everything possible, to keep this situation, on the radar screen of Congress. As I said earlier, the Congress right now is in a very negative mood towards Russia. It's not going to take a heck of a lot, to keep the pressure on the side of the United States against Russia. So I think all of these things, can help. And you can also contribute. Ambassador Latushka mentioned some of these funds, that have been established, and perhaps he might want to, repeat again if these funds are open to, individual contributions, because that can also help.
Thank you very much. I'll give Ambassador Latushka a chance in a minute to respond to that. One more question for you, Marek. Do you think that Moscow's response is, I guess, to what's happening in Belarus is connected to its overall will to extend itself in Belarus as well as its actions in NK? Do you see a connection between this and, I guess, other issues that Moscow is dealing with right now?
Well, obviously there is a connection, and in a sense that this is a post-Soviet area which is recognized by Moscow unilaterally, of course, as a Russian sphere of influence. So that means, first of all, that Russia is not ready to accept a presence of the states or institutions which the Kremlin perceives as adversary. That especially means US, that means the EU and NATO. And of course, Belarus is a very key point. It's a very strategic point as the Western outpost, the most Western outpost of the post-Soviet space from the Russian perspective. The military cooperation with Belarus is very intensive. This is a strategic area. But on the other hand, we now seeing that well, the Russian policy towards post-Soviet space is very fragmented. There is no single strategy. There are strategies, there are tactics, there's very tactical policies. It's very responsive policy. And it also, also towards Belarus. Belarus is as I said, is very specific, is very important. Therefore, Russia is not ready to accept any kind of, to stay indifferent. Russia cannot allow itself to stay indifferent. Unfortunately for Belarus, because that means that the stakes are high for the Kremlin, and that means that paradoxically, because of the current revolution, because we may call it revolution in Belarus, is strengthening the Russian support for the current regime in Belarus. That's very unfortunate. But I would like to also touch upon the other point raised, which is our response. First of all, we have to understand that many sanctions have been already in place for many years, both from the EU and the US towards Belarus. That's first point. So if some people believe that it's not enough, of course, it's only an addition. For example, we have arms embargo. We have embargo on dual-use products which may serve a repression towards Belarus by the regime. These are banned to export to Belarus. Also, there are new waves of sanctions now in the pipeline, mostly individual sanctions, but there are another element of very useful type of sanctions. This is sanctions toward the companies who are linked to individuals within the Belarus regime, including Lukashenko family, personally. So sanctioning those kind of enterprises, those kind of companies, will also be a strike, a direct strike towards those who are responsible for the current repressive policy. And on the other hand, very important is a support for civil society in Belarus. There's a lot of going on, which Ambassador Wilczek also mentioned. For example, there are packages, financial packages of support for Belarus media, for Belarus victims of repressions. So there is medical evacuations, there are support in kind, there is support in financial terms for the refugees. The research programs for students who are being thrown out of the universities in Belarus. Of course, it does not kind of sort out the problem, but it's still, it's good to mention. And I think there is more we can do. We can more support independent media in Belarus. We can support more externally Belarusian media abroad, which are also trying to reach out to the Belarusian themselves. Internet technologies, support for overcoming blockades in internet in Belarus. not to allow Western companies to support Lukashenko regime in blocking internet in Belarus. There are so technical support and expanding support for Belarus diasporas. These people will be very important. I mean, Belarus diasporas, also temporary diasporas, are very important because they have direct linkage to the country, and these people will return to Belarus to build new democratic Belarus when eventually the situation allows for that. So they need our support, and we should support them.
Thank you very much. I'm sure all the audience will join me in thanking all of our panelists for an extremely interesting and very sobering discussion. Again, thank you for giving your time. I would like to thank the Polish Embassy for putting this on. And hopefully, if we can reconvene in a few months, we will have better news. Thank you all.